you're a British citizen, lived in the country most of your life. How strange is it to know that your tax dollars are being used against you by your government, which they are? And how bewildering is it to find that the open contest of ideas that we were promised here in the West, may the best idea win, is a sham?
Yes, well, I suppose I went into the entertainment industry really with the giddy trajectory that propels a lot of people into those spaces, believing that there might be some fulfillment, and certainly there would be excitement. And when I was a denizen of that world, I was fostered and adored and celebrated and facilitated and lived the kind of lifestyle which I think is kind of common for people in that area, for single people, in my case, drug and alcohol free, but certainly with an appetite for a promiscuous lifestyle. When I was part of it, I found it empty and unfulfilling, of course, as it would be, as anyone who's had those kind of experiences ultimately realizes. When I departed it, as a result really of various spiritual crises or commercial failures or a combination of those events, I really felt like a coming home to the type of values that I grew up with. I grew up in a normal blue-collar town, Grays, kind of like a place that's like New Jersey, I guess, a kind of suburban, outside of the city, normal people, good values kind of place. And what I feel like happened is like, well, since I've had a family, since, you know, I've got a young son, I've got a couple of daughters, is I feel like that I was able to deploy the skills learned through working in entertainment as a man in recovery in a new space. And what simply began with myself and my partners is tell the truth about things you care about. Kind of over time, it began to, I suppose Glenn Greenwald the other day, and he goes, you know, you shouldn't be surprised that if you attack the most powerful interests in the world, the deep state, powerful corporations, the machinery of war, that you yourself are the recipient of attacks. Why is that surprising to you? I know, but because sometimes it does feel speculative, doesn't it? You're talking about these really powerful organizations and the way that it's funded and the way that it crosses over and their malfeasant, underhanded, insidious activity. And then as it starts to become more popular, as more and more people realize that it's actually true, as more and more people become willing to take back control in their own lives, as more and more people refuse to consent to being treated in this sort of infantile way, having their autonomy and personal and mental and spiritual freedom undermined, their connection to their land undermined, their connection to nature devoided, you start to realize that you're actually operating in quite a powerful territory, that while power is very serious and it has to work very hard to maintain its grip. So these organizations, did it surprise me to find that the British government, through the Department of Culture and Media and Sport, the very people that sponsored the new, rather draconian online safety bill, personally contacted the height of these allegations and attacks on me, contacted social media platforms and asked if I would be demonetized. But they're the body that regulates them. They have the ability to find those organizations. They're the very person who is sponsoring the online security bill.
Pause for a second, just to make sure I understand what you're saying. So these accusations appeared. There were, I don't know if this has changed, but at the time, there were no names attached at all. You were accused anonymously of committing crimes. And then your own government, which you pay for, reached out without telling you to online service providers and media organizations and said, please kick him off and censor him and take his money away. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, that's
before
right.
Any kind of trial, before any proof that you were guilty, before any names were attached. That happened.
Yeah, and it's the same people that are sponsoring online safety bills, which amount to facilitating further censorship.
But what a betrayal by your own government.
Well, it's astonishing if you regard your government to be in a position of service rather than a position of domination and control. But what's become apparent in recent years is what the nature of our relationship with government is, that they are there to rule and control and dominate. And whilst they may now do it with an aesthetic of care and with the language of inclusivity, I believe the threat of authoritarianism is far, far greater from those that use the language of liberalism than these emergent, somewhat nationalistically oriented populist movements present, because they are leveraging that power now. They're interested in censorship. They're militarizing the police force. They're introducing protest laws. They're of introducing censorship laws. Through their actions, we can observe them. Through their fruits, can we know them? We can see what they... And if you try to dissent, if you try to oppose, even what I consider to be a relatively marginal scale, then the consequences are severe and immediate and robust and terrifying.
I think what makes your specific case so compelling is that if they could do it to you, a person who had the admiration of a lot of people who weren't interested in politics and was pretty famous and had some means, et cetera, then the average person stands no chance. What I missed, and I'm now seeing, is that in March of 2022, you were denounced by an organization connected directly to the U.S. government as an agent of Chinese propaganda for your views on Ukraine. So let me just ask you your experience of this. Did you know that you were being attacked as a Chinese propagandist for your views on Ukraine?
I actually didn't, and still at this point struggle to see entirely what the connections are between those two issues, and how I would develop and cultivate a strong affinity with China. I've never been to China. I don't purport to understand China. Certainly don't advocate for Chinese policy. I've just got a relatively superficial dilettante knowledge of geopolitical matters in the South Asian seas. It's not something that I would like tie my colours to the mast for, or be willing to be publicly shamed, attacked, and even jailed for.
So it happened, though.
Yeah.
And a lot happens on the internet that we miss. But these, in my reading of it, and we haven't, by the way, talked about this off air, but my reading of it is that these were the early seeds of a very deceptive plant that flowered more than a year later in September when you were accused of these crimes and demonetized and censored as a result of that. But looking back, so you were accused by a group called Coda Story. It published a story on its anti-disinformation newsletter. Now, Coda Story is connected to the UK government, but it's also connected to the CIA. How does it make you feel to know that you were in the crosshairs of two of the most powerful governments in the world and their intel agencies?
It seems to me ridiculously grandiose to even imagine that I would stir and arouse the interests of such powerful agencies and groups, that the British government, if indirectly, would spend considerable sums on observing and de-amplifying content, that true information shared through our platforms in the period of the pandemic was censored, was cited as high risk, that companies like Moderna had spent considerable revenue tracking our content and again de-amplifying it, that Dame Caroline Dinenage, whose husband is a psyops expert that worked abroad in terrorism before deploying those methods and techniques and to some degree those teams to observe what they call disinformation and misinformation in the UK. I recognise that the new emergent media spaces present a lot of possibilities, even with your kind compliments about our reporting on the Ukraine. All we've essentially done is listen to brilliant academics talking about the history of NATO and the coup in 2014 in Ukraine and Putin's explicit declaration that he would prefer, let's put it mildly, that Ukraine were not invited into NATO, some of the regional disputes, how they're escalating tensions. This is information that, because of independent media, is available, and perhaps the function that we, our media organisation, have fulfilled is been to collate that information and convey it directly in an accessible manner to give people an alternative perspective to the homogenized mainstream opinion, which amounts to, I've learned over the last few years, the amplification and normalization of the agenda of the powerful, that no opinions can be allowed into that space. And I'm astonished by how jealously it is guarded. There are points in my life where my personal self-regard would have loved the idea that I would be considered important enough to attack on this scale, to spend this amount of revenue and resources on. But I'm now seeing that independent media itself is an extraordinary threat, that independent media inevitably leads to independent politics and independent thought. And we appear to be at some precipitous moment of radical transition. I'm not sure, and I'm not sure if anybody could be sure of where this is all heading, what the exact teleology is, but it seems to be to do with mass centralization, globalization, significant attempts to control the information space that are so rigorously adhered to and protected that even what you might imagine to be a marginal voice is considered a significant enough threat to warrant coordinated media attacks, expenditure on peculiar, clandestine, non-government organizations and think tanks that take their money from the military-industrial complex, from the legacy media, who, by the way, when they're critiquing independent media, they got skin in the game. They're not able to independently assess your work or my work or the medical opinions of Joe Rogan. They have a vested interest in destroying those organizations. In the last few years, I've learned about the Trusted News Initiative, which has extraordinary connections again to Big Pharma and sets of interest around the reporting on war, that have decided and determined that they are no longer competing with one another. You in particular come from a journalistic background where it would have been commonplace for the great institutions of American media to compete with one another for scoops. The New York Times versus the world. Those days are gone. It explicitly states on the Trusted News Initiative website, we are no longer in competition with one another. We have to curtail and stamp out, I think it even uses the word choke, independent media. And it's clear that there are now sets of globalist organizations funded by government, but also corporations, that are making deliberate, profound attempts to shut down any dissent in an astonishingly aggressive way. And to be sort of caught up in it is terrifying on one level, absolutely terrifying, particularly due to the nature of allegations that I faced, but also revealing. More importantly, it's revealing about the way that I believe the world, and in particular this space, will be affected, and the way these events will continue to unfold in the coming years.